In a courtroom meant to symbolize order and justice, chaos erupted with a single slap, a slap that would become the spark for an explosive reckoning. It began like any other morning in Charleston, South Carolina, as a 62-year-old woman entered the courthouse unnoticed. With silver-streaked hair and a quiet dignity, Clara May didn't wear her judge's robe yet, and to the eyes of Sergeant Travis Boone and his fellow officer, she was just another face in the room, someone beneath their concern. When Clara calmly questioned Boone's impatience with court procedure, his response was swift, violent, and arrogant. An open-handed slap that cracked through the air like thunder. Gasps rippled across the room. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the woman he had just assaulted was the presiding judge. Clara didn't flinch. She simply turned, climbed the steps to the bench, and took her seat. The shift in the room was seismic. Boone froze, realizing too late that he had just committed a criminal assault on a judge, in front of witnesses and under court surveillance. In that moment, the veil of unchecked authority was ripped away. Clara's voice, calm but cutting, became the blade that severed silence from complicity. This was no longer about misconduct. It was about power, entitlement, and the belief that some people don't belong in power simply because of who they are. For decades, Clara had walked those marble halls as a defense attorney, a prosecutor, and now as a judge, always aware of how her race and gender invited scrutiny, if not contempt. But that day, she didn't just reveal herself as the judge. She revealed the truth, that behind every abuse of power is a system that protects it until someone brave enough decides not to stay silent anymore. The instant Judge Clara May ascended the bench, the courtroom shifted from routine to reckoning. Moments earlier, she had stood in silence, dressed in civilian clothes, calmly reviewing files while Sergeant Travis Boone, the officer who had just slapped her across the face, assumed she was nobody. He didn't see a judge, only a black woman who, in his mind, didn't deserve his attention or respect. But as she stepped onto the platform and took her seat behind the judge's bench, gasps erupted. The gavel had not yet struck, but the verdict was already in. Boone was no longer the one in control. Clara's tone remained calm, but every word she spoke cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. When she asked Boone directly, "Did you just strike me in this courtroom?" the color drained from his face. His defense, "I didn't know who you were," wasn't just weak, it was damning. It revealed exactly what Clara had known all along, that his authority wasn't built on truth, but on the assumption that he would never be held accountable. In front of attorneys, journalists, and fellow officers, Clara laid bare the rot beneath the uniform. She recited the long trail of misconduct Boone had left behind, the complaints erased, the force used without cause, and the protection he'd always relied on from the system. But this time, the system stared back at him, in the form of the very woman he had struck. Clara didn't just reclaim control of the courtroom, she redefined what justice could look like when power is challenged head-on. By initiating an on-the-record investigation and ensuring the moment was preserved by surveillance and witness testimony, she left no room for the usual erasure. In that pivotal exchange, she flipped decades of silence into a roar. Clara's bench was no longer a seat of quiet authority, it became a stage for truth, accountability, and the dismantling of unchecked power. That day, the judge didn't just deliver justice, she embodied it. What began as a slap in a courtroom swiftly escalated into the unraveling of an entire system of corruption, carefully hidden beneath layers of institutional silence. Judge Clara May knew from the moment Boone's hand struck her face that this wasn't just about a single act of violence, it was about everything that had made him feel entitled to do it. With the strike caught on surveillance and witnessed by court officials and the press, Clara had undeniable proof. But she wanted more than justice for herself. She wanted the truth behind the silence. As internal affairs and federal investigators joined forces, Clara began peeling back the layers of Boone's record. And what she found was staggering. 19 formal complaints, repeated use of force incidents, disappearing body cam footage, prosecutors who refused to press charges despite overwhelming evidence. Patterns emerged, too clean, too deliberate. It wasn't just Boone. It was the officers who covered for him, the district attorneys who enabled him, the judges who looked the other way. Clara had walked the courthouse halls for over 30 years, but now, for the first time, she realized just how deep the rot went. She worked tirelessly, compiling names, cases, timelines. She partnered with internal affairs agents Rosalind Keene and Felix Reyes, who provided confidential files, whistleblower tips, and hidden audio revealing Boone's confidence that he was untouchable. And he was, for decades. But not anymore. Clara's investigation soon exposed a network. Ada Carson Ramsey, who had personally dropped excessive force cases tied to Boone, retired officers who signed off on falsified reports, city officials who rerouted public funds to protect corrupt officers under the guise of legal defense. The slap had pulled a thread, and now the entire fabric was coming undone. Clara realized this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a moral reckoning. She initiated a full-scale review of every case Boone had ever touched, demanded independent audits, and took her findings to federal authorities. In doing so, Clara shifted the narrative, from a story about a disrespectful cop to a systemic crisis involving law enforcement, prosecution, and political protection. The abuse of power had been normalized for too long, but now, because one woman refused to stay silent, it was finally being named, challenged, and dismantled. One slap ignited a revolution. As the investigation widened and names began surfacing, Judge Clara May quickly became more than a whistleblower. She became a threat to a deeply entrenched system. The higher she climbed in her pursuit of justice, the more dangerous the terrain became. It started with anonymous messages. Then came the chilling photograph of her young nephew walking home from school, slipped into her chambers, with the words, "Stay in your lane." For any other person, it might have been enough to walk away. But not Clara, not after everything she had seen, not after everything she had survived. Instead of retreating, she escalated. She contacted the U.S. Marshals, requested immediate protection for her family, and demanded Boone be transferred to federal custody. This wasn't just about a slap or a crooked cop anymore. Clara understood that she had pulled back a curtain that powerful people were desperate to keep closed. She wasn't just naming misconduct, she was threatening to bring down an entire apparatus built on silence, fear, and mutual protection. When city officials tried to frame her as emotionally compromised to remove her from the Boone case, Clara didn't flinch. She publicly recused herself, not out of weakness, but to prevent them from burying the case quietly. She held a press conference, called for an independent federal monitor, and laid bare the pattern of corruption, from lost evidence to shady financial ties between the police union and city prosecutors. The backlash was swift. Smear campaigns, fake news articles, even attacks on her college activism. But Clara came armed with documentation, allies, and a voice sharpened by decades of injustice. With the support of internal affairs and federal agents, she turned the threats into evidence and the fear into fuel. Clara wasn't just defending her integrity, she was rewriting the rules of accountability. She showed that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. And though the system fought back, it was already too late. The door had been opened, and Clara had no intention of letting it close again. The moment Judge Clara May ignited the investigation, the fallout was unstoppable. What began with a single act of defiance in a courtroom unraveled into a full-scale collapse of Charleston's legal and political machinery. As Boone sat in federal custody, no longer protected by the badge he once weaponized, the ripple effect spread fast. Assistant District Attorney Carson Ramsey, who had once dismissed excessive force cases like routine paperwork, resigned in disgrace, soon facing a plea deal of his own. Retired Judge Hal Craftoft, Clara's former mentor and the man who once swore her into office, was suspended pending investigation after documents linked him to the quiet disappearance of civil rights complaints involving Boone and his associates. Internal Affairs, the DOJ, and independent review boards flooded the system with subpoenas and audits. Within weeks, over 140 past convictions connected to Boone and his network were flagged for potential misconduct. Several precinct captains were fired. 3 officers turned state's evidence, and whispers began circling of a private contractor tied to both City Hall and illegal data suppression. Those who once moved in shadow were now caught under the full glare of public scrutiny. But Clara didn't celebrate. She knew this wasn't victory, it was the beginning of reconstruction. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was demanding. At a press conference watched nationwide, Clara stood not behind a bench, but before the people, revealing a list of names tied to corruption and calling for a federal oversight committee to ensure justice, no longer bent to convenience. Her message was clear. This was no longer about a single officer, or even a single courthouse. It was about a culture of impunity nurtured over decades and now finally held to account. Clara's fire had spread through City Hall, courtrooms, and police departments, not as destruction, but as the cleansing heat of truth. And though the structure was collapsing, it was making room for something better to be built in its place. When the dust began to settle, Judge Clara May made a decision that shocked many. She resigned, not because she was forced to, not because she was defeated, but because she understood that true change requires more than one person, no matter how courageous. Clara had sparked a movement that reached beyond the walls of her courtroom, shaking the foundations of Charleston's justice system. But she knew that rebuilding an institution meant letting new voices rise, voices that wouldn't have to fight the same battles just to be heard. Her resignation speech was powerful and quiet, delivered without bitterness. She stood before the State Judiciary Review Board and a crowd of reporters and citizens, stating, "I lit a fire. It is not for me to stand in its glow." She wasn't stepping away from justice. She was stepping aside to protect it. Clara had always understood the weight of symbolism, and this moment would become one of the most defining symbols of her legacy. She emphasized that justice isn't about power, it's about accountability. She challenged the board to ensure that the next black woman who wore the robe wouldn't have to survive a scandal to earn respect. Clara's decision echoed far beyond Charleston. Her story inspired national conversations about judicial ethics, police accountability, and systemic reform. She was offered television interviews, speaking engagements, even political endorsements. But she chose instead to return to her family's home in Mount Pleasant. There, in the quiet, she could finally breathe. When her nephew ran into her arms after school, telling her proudly, "I saw you on TV, you made them listen," she didn't correct him. She simply said, "I made them look, listening is still up to them." Clara left the bench, but not the fight. Her actions proved that stepping down isn't surrender, it's strategy. And sometimes the most powerful way to lead a revolution is to leave space for it to grow beyond yourself. Judge Clara May's decision to speak out didn't just bring justice to one courtroom, it sent shockwaves across the entire state. Her courage sparked a movement that forced South Carolina's institutions to look inward, and what they found wasn't just a few bad actors but a culture of complicity that had been allowed to fester for decades. Following Boone's conviction and the exposure of a coordinated network of corruption, a statewide task force was immediately formed. Their mandate: to audit all past convictions involving Boone and his known collaborators. Over 140 cases were flagged for misconduct, leading to retrials, overturned convictions, and in some instances, formal apologies from the state to wrongfully accused citizens, many of them young black men who had never stood a chance in a system rigged against them. The Charleston Police Department was placed under full federal oversight, and the city's district attorney's office underwent a sweeping leadership overhaul. A bipartisan coalition was established to draft new legislation aimed at increasing transparency in law enforcement and judiciary practices, including mandatory body cam audits, independent prosecutor review panels, and term accountability reports for sitting judges and district attorneys. Clara's name became synonymous with integrity, but she never sought the spotlight. Still, the media dubbed her the judge who broke the silence, and survivors of police misconduct began organizing under her banner. Protests turned into petitions. Petitions became policy. In the weeks that followed, other judges, officers, and officials across the state stepped forward, some in solidarity, others in shame. Clara's story gave them either courage or consequence. Even the governor, under pressure from an enraged and awakened public, issued a statement acknowledging the systemic failures that Clara's actions had uncovered. But perhaps most telling was what happened outside the courthouse. Young people began to show up to city meetings. Law students cited Clara's case in ethics discussions. A mural appeared on the courthouse wall, not of Clara's face but of a bench, cracked open to let light through. What Clara ignited wasn't just reform, it was transformation. Not a single law had been passed yet, but everything had already changed. The system couldn't go back to what it was, because now it had been seen. This story reminds us that silence, though often seen as safe, can become a silent accomplice to injustice. Judge Clara May's journey is not just about courage in the courtroom. It's about the lifelong responsibility to stand for truth, especially when the cost is high. For many older adults who have witnessed decades of social change, this story speaks to a deeper truth, that progress is not guaranteed, and justice does not happen on its own. It must be demanded, even when it's uncomfortable. Clara's refusal to stay silent, even in the face of personal risk, is a powerful reminder that integrity does not retire with age. In fact, it becomes more essential. Her legacy wasn't just in the rulings she made, but in the values she upheld when it mattered most. As we grow older, we carry not only memories, but the wisdom to know when to speak, when to act, and when to pass the torch. This story encourages us to ensure the next generation doesn't inherit silence, but a voice, one shaped by experience, anchored in principle, and unafraid to challenge a system that needs to be better. Because justice is not just for the young, it is for the enduring.